so much. And you can all hear me and see me. It's all good?
Yes.
All right, cool. So thank you so much for inviting me here. And it's so beautiful in Vancouver. So if it's not sunny where you are, I'm sending some rare sunshine from the coast. And thanks to David so much for that musical opening. I don't think I've ever had that happen before. I was up and dancing around and playing with my cat, who's very hyper at the moment. So you'll probably see him run across the desk at some point, but it's just working at home. So let's get started. So in June 2018, I set out on a quest. It was a quest to visit all the champion trees in British Columbia. For those of you who don't know, champion trees are the largest of their species, and they're both deciduous and conifer trees. So why did I start this? Well, I was looking for a project to commemorate 1 year living back in Vancouver. I'd returned home to the West Coast after spending 9 years in Toronto, where I worked as a book editor. And I was thinking about starting a blog to chronicle some of the hiking trips I've been making to local mountains and parks. And I was getting into bouldering and I was just living more outside. But when I shared the idea with my friend, Kate Harris, who's an intrepid adventurer and author of a travel memoir called Lands of Lost Borders, which is about cycling the Silk Road, she didn't explicitly use the word boring about that blog idea, but she suggested a different approach. She'd recently learned about this thing called the BC Big Tree Registry, and she suggested that I visit all of the champion trees, which are on that registry. And I just leapt at the idea. I decided that day to do this project. There were just over 40 trees on the list at that time, and the trees are located all over the province of BC. I thought the project would be an ideal way to reacquaint myself with my home province. And for those of you who know me, who are on this in this event today, in typically ambitious fashion, I thought I would find them all and find them all in a year. Overachievers die long, hard deaths. Some of the trees were no longer standing. Others had been displaced by runners up that had grown larger. This is the thing about looking for trees, is that they don't really stay the same. If you're trying to bag all 8,000-meter peaks, the peaks don't really change size much in your lifetime. So I would learn on this quest that a tree reduced in size by lightning could no longer be the champion, that minute shifts in GPS coordinates could throw me off a tree's trail, and that even a champion tree might not be all that big when compared across species. When I started the project, I could barely tell a birch from a beech, or read a map, or measure a tree, but I needed the project as a way to regain confidence in myself. So as a child in BC, trees were familiar to me in landscape, but also culture and economy. So I was familiar with cut blocks and replanted forests, or Bill Reed's carving of the raven and the first man up at UBC, or log booms drifting down the Fraser River, which flowed just below where I grew up. I also was familiar with brown trees that had been destroyed by mountain pine beetle, and the marks of springboard planks in huge old cedar or Douglas fir stumps that had been cut down and were now nursing stems to slender trees. I'd grown up in an area of Surrey with old growth stands intermixed with all the subdivisions. And I was spoiled by bigness, used to towering trees, which is very much the case on the coast. So I was 10 years old when the Clayoquot Sound protests happened. This is the so-called War in the Woods. And it just captured my imagination as I watched the protests on the nightly news with my family. Then, when I was 17, I read this book that changed the trajectory of my life. It was called The Legacy of Luna by Julia Butterfly Hill. Luna was a redwood in Humboldt County in Northern California, which is home to so many giant redwoods. And this tree was threatened to be cleared by Pacific Lumber, which is the forestry company. Julia Butterfly Hill climbed into the tree and sat there on a platform 180 feet up to prevent the tree being cut down. And you can see her there on the left. She stayed on that platform for over 2 years. And even at that early age, I admired such firm resolve and sacrifice. But I was also a lover of the indoors, of books and of words. So I went on to study literature, becoming an editor in Toronto. I slowly built a niche editing books about social change and the environment, including, in a full circle moment, a memoir of that time in Clayoquot by Vancouver's own Zipporah Berman. So I'd found a way to really connect my interests. The same instinct that led me to think I could find all the champion trees in a year was the one that propelled me to give everything I had to my job and to volunteering in environmental communications in my off hours. I felt I could excel in one way only, through my intellect. But after falling out of love with my life in Toronto and moving home to root myself again, I completely burned out because that emphasis on the intellect just wasn't the full version of myself. Then after I burned out, I succumbed to a long-lasting flu. So I was basically toast for a good 6 months, but I caught up on all my TV shows. So, but after I recovered, I really wanted to find a way to build up my strength and to measure myself by a new standard, by finding examples of bigness in the world that were not linked to career or advancement or romantic entanglements. Anne Helen Peterson, author of Can't Even, a book on millennial burnout, said, quote, "Burnout is actually a sense of hopelessness, and one thing that prevents it is a sense of accomplishment. I felt that unquote, I felt that finding the trees would be accomplishment enough and reignite my love for this landscape. These adventures would renew hope and once again light that fire that was ignited by Julia Butterfly Hill's book all those years ago. And maybe my secret hope was maybe they turn me into a more rugged version of myself, like hashtag van life all the way." So what is the BC Big Tree Registry? In short, it's a database. It's maintained by volunteers, and it records the biggest conifers and deciduous trees according to height, circumference, and crown spread. Anyone can nominate a tree. Forestry professionals verify the measurements and determine if the tree is in the top 10 in the province or the number one slot, the champion. So let's explain a little bit about these slides, these photos on the slide here, because it's kind of important for how the process works. So that's me standing in front of what we think is the biggest interior Douglas fir in the province. And interior Douglas fir is just a bit different from coastal Douglas firs, which a lot of us are familiar with in Vancouver. But to find this tree, I'd gone looking for the champion Douglas fir, which is growing on Highway 3 on the road to Princeton. And it's very visible from the highway. But when I finally got to it, I realized that it had been hit by lightning and it was no longer as big as it had been, even though it was really big still. So it was covered in soot, and I measured it, and it was no longer the champion. But the runner-up tree was located in this grove near Merritt. So my friend Cody and I drove out to see these trees, and the tree that you see has fallen was the second biggest tree. But of course, it was no longer the champion because it had fallen. So then I'm standing with the third runner-up that's now the new champion, but there are probably bigger trees. So you can see how this project just keeps going and will probably never finish. And then that's a photo of me just striding along on Cypress because the project is also really, really fun. So the BC Big Tree Registry developed in response to the logging of old growth forests in the late 80s and early 90s, specifically a desire to know what was left on the west coast of Vancouver Island. One activist and mountaineer named Randy Stoltman, who lived in West Vancouver and had explored significant forests of southwestern BC, began keeping informal records of big trees. So if he saw a big cedar in Lynn Valley, he'd write that down, measure it, draw a map. He wrote 3 books about wild areas of BC, including 2 hiking guides for finding big trees, and he campaigned to preserve the ancient rainforest of the Comanna Valley on Vancouver Island. But tragically, Randy died in a mountaineering accident in 1994, and he was only 31. The records he'd amassed remained in bankers' boxes until they were brought to UBC's forestry department, where a committee digitized the records and launched the online registry in 2014. The BC Big Tree Registry is not unique. There are similar registries in other regions of North America. Some jurisdictions record monumental trees or heritage trees, those that have significance because of size or historical import. If you've been in Portland, you may have seen a bunch around the city at the university, and they're indicated with plaques, which makes it really easy. There are no plaques on these champion trees. Some of the entries in the registry have photos and GPS, others are on private land with location withheld, or they're in watersheds where access is forbidden. Some of these champions grow in urban areas and come up against the real challenges of development. So on this slide, the photo of me with the red backpack, that's me going toward the champion arbutus in the province. And when I started this project, a lot of people said, "Where's the biggest arbutus?" Everyone loves the arbutus, which is the red skin tree that the bark peels like skin. This one is huge. And for a while, I thought it was located on Department of National Defense ground, so I couldn't go see it. But then I realized it was just outside the fence. So those boundaries really do matter when you're tree tracking. And then on the right, it's me in front of the San Juan spruce, which for a time was, I think, the biggest tree in Canada, and then the top fell off. It's still huge though. So it's, I don't know, Trees, they just keep changing. I learned pretty quickly that I wouldn't always see a tree my first time out or at all. So I started viewing each trip as an adventure, or what Alistair Humphreys would call a micro adventure, as a lot of the trees were a day trip from my home in East Vancouver. Taken together, these trips formed a secular pilgrimage around the province, a chance to commune with an ancient being that would awaken awe and transcendence within me. At least that was the hope. Mostly it's me spinning in the forest, trying to beat sunset and avoid getting lost. So I don't have time to show you all the trees I've looked for and found, so in this talk, I'll focus on just a few, like this one, the champion western hemlock growing on Coliseum Mountain on the North Shore. You reach Coliseum by walking 7 kilometers along a well-worn path running parallel to the creek in the in the Lynn Valley watershed. Then you hike 5 kilometers up a debris-filled slope to about 700-meter elevation. On this occasion, it's my third time looking for this tree. Both previous times I'd turned around because of poor direction and trail condition. There was snow, there were bears in the area. My boyfriend Jason and I went back last summer and we climbed this gnarly slope, avoiding root holes and seeing huge stumps that had been logged in the 20s. But where the trail leveled out, above all that logging, we were met with a rich understory and towering trees, a mix of old growth cedar, Douglas fir, and hemlock. We were looking for a western hemlock that had last been measured at 46 meters tall with a diameter of just over 3 meters. But first verified in 1999 and without recent records, there was no guarantee the tree was still standing. Looking for a tree in a forest is truly like looking for a needle in a haystack. Jason triangulated us toward the tree and we found it growing about 200 meters off the path. It was healthy, it was standing in a clearing of its own making, and I got to it by walking raccoon style along a log, and I touched its bark and its light coating of moss. I pressed my ear to its trunk, and then it was a fast descent back to the car and another champion crossed off my list. So in the beginning of this project, I was fumbling, and now I'm still fumbling. I know a little bit more about trees, but in my wanderings for trees over the past couple of years, I've learned a few lessons about creativity that I'm going to share with you. And because I'm a book editor, we're going to go in chapters. Chapter 1, Go Big, Stay Home. I know, we're all so sick of staying home. I'd planned for this talk to be in a room with you, and now I'm in the same room I always am. But in order to preserve what we have, health, community, jobs, lives, we need to stay micro-local for the time being. We go big by staying home. We live within our limits. The province of BC is huge. It's just over 945,000 square kilometers with 14 biogeoclimatic zones, which is a fancy way of saying that the terrain is unique and the climate is unique all over the province. The champions are all over, but a lot of them are growing along the southern coast and the southern islands. That's partially because these areas are largely populated, so the big trees are noticed more readily, and partially because these areas have been heavily logged, so the trees have been found in the process of surveying. So a lot of these trees are found by forestry companies. In Vancouver, we have a lot of options. The champion big leaf maple and red alder both grow in Stanley Park, or the champion bitter cherry grows near the bus loop in North Vancouver, and you would not know that it's there. It's in this overgrown lot that's covered in garbage at times. The champion list gives me limits in which to explore, and the same is true of our creative projects. We can give ourselves constraints to enhance our imaginative reach, like a time limit or a word count or specific materials. I give my writers deadlines all the time, and that can be a limit, and not always a welcome one, but it helps sometimes. We can go on a neighborhood photo shoot, taking photos of only blue doors or yellow leaves. We can write a free verse poem, or we can challenge ourselves even further with the confines of a sonnet. During the pandemic, a lot more people are connecting with nature. In the early months, we heard accounts of animals taking back waterways and parks. And some of these stories were later revealed as hoaxes. But since the silence of the pandemic started in the spring, we are inundated with birdsong, and some new birders learned the names of the birds that have always lived nearby, and some that appeared for the first time. Where someone said to me, "What are those birds? Have they always lived here?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "I don't think so." I said, "No, it's true." And people flocked to neighboring hills and mountains for hikes. Mostly we kept our circle really small so we could experience a bigger world later. I mentioned that I see this project as a series of small pilgrimages, and I'm not messing around with the idea of pilgrimage. In December 2019, I hiked a section of the Kumano Kodo in Japan, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But pilgrimage can be local. We don't need to burn carbon to go to Japan or to the Camino to make it count. We do pilgrimages in our life all the time. We go see the home of a writer that we admire, or make a pilgrimage to, I remember when I was a kid, West Edmonton Mall was like, oh my God, I can't wait to go there. I planned a multi-day trip to Vancouver Island in April to see the biggest of the big champions, Western red cedar, Douglas fir, Sitka spruce. Instead, when we were all staying home, I found myself recreating that trip on a smaller scale. The Western red cedar growing near my balcony, the tall Douglas firs growing in Pacific Spirit Park. Living within our limits can mean refusing to fly. It can mean not venturing into the forest alone, or it can mean committing to publishing a blog post a day or a painting. Chapter 2, Stride Forth. I'm not an arborist, I'm not a forester, I'm a book editor. So how can that possibly qualify me as a big tree tracker? Well, it turns out that the requirements are more similar than you might think, and they're emblematic of the creative process. Above all, a willingness to be curious, to ask questions, to seek, to find. An editor's job is to find patterns, an idea teased out in some places but not others, a word repeated 25 times in a chapter. A big tree tracker learns to look for patterns too. On Google Earth, looking for density that indicates the forest hasn't been cleared, or using the evidence to determine good grow sites where big trees might be found. So in my world, looking for good grow sites might mean reading literary journals or tweets or manuscripts, trying to find the next interesting voice or where those voices gather. In both cases, it's a process of gathering. This is a longer quote, but I think it's worth reading in its entirety. So Jerry Saltz is an art critic in New York, and he wrote this great book called How to Be an Artist, which is Lessons for Artists. So I'll just read it along with you. You are a pearl diver, a rock collector, a shell hunter combing the beach for inspiration. You're an archaeologist of forms, tropes, sensations, spaces, light, identities, micro and macrocosms, moss, a pattern recognition machine and code breaker. You are probing for ideas even if you don't know what you're hoping to find. Anything goes. Never stop throwing your nets into those fundamental waters. Throw them out, haul them back in again. Even when they're empty, that frantic energy, that perverse need to keep looking till you can't imagine finding more, can keep you receptive to new metaphors, materials, and meaning. This striding forth to gather follows the creative process. You never know when or where you'll find material, but it's often in the natural world. There have been plenty of encapsulations of the creative process over the years, usually into 4 or 5 steps, and I find it looks somewhat like this. You get an idea. So my case might be, there's a big tree in Stanley Park. Rush forward with enthusiasm. I'm going to find this thing before lunch. Realize the project is a lot harder than it looks. Gather more help and resources. Have you seen the tree? Do more research. What does this tree look like? Push through my level of unknowing, and finally reach a state of completion with some answers to my questions, but perhaps not all. Editors look for the biggest and best in their writers, their ideas, their selves, and present them to the world. They help writers achieve their full potential. We can think of champion trees as those trees that have achieved their potential by growing as big as they can, often in community with other trees, as we know increasingly how trees communicate with each other and hold each other up. As creators, we go out looking for the biggest and best idea, and sometimes we find it. Sometimes we find something almost as good. Sometimes we find something better. Sometimes we fail, and that failure leads to new successes. I firmly believe that creative blocks become building blocks. And I get it. There's a constant need in life to get it right. As an editor, getting it right is what I do. Even if I'm proofreading something, I'm literally looking for errors on the page. But with the Champions Project, I had to learn to become comfortable with failure, with looking for the trees over and over, with asking for help, with being in uncomfortable situations, but never unsafe. I've tried and I've been wrong. I've thought I found champion trees and I've dutifully sent in my coordinates and measurements and photos. And later I've been corrected by people who've been doing this a lot longer than me. Like, that's not even that tree, or the champion you're looking for was like down the road. Okay. And sometimes that failure is out of my hands. A tree falls, like this grand fir that I'll show you on the next slide, please. So I went looking for this grand fir in Chilliwack. And the first time I went out there, the road was iced over. I couldn't get down there because who knew that, ice would form in Canada in winter. And then I went back a couple more times when the weather was warmer, and I went with people who really knew this area of Chilliwack. So this is the Chilliwack Ecological Reserve following along the Chilliwack River. We went looking for this grand fir that was 75 meters tall. And we looked and we looked and we followed the map and we followed the GPS and we just couldn't find it. And we left thinking it must have fallen down because there's a lot of blowdown in the forest, which means that wind knocked down trees. And I was okay with that. And then this guy, Sean O'Rourke, who's an archaeologist, and he just moved down from Terrace to Vancouver. He heard about the BC Big Tree Registry, and he reached out to me and a few others on the committee and said, I'm interested in this grand fir. And I said, well, let me tell you a thing or two about this grand fir that I know so much about. I don't think it's standing. And Sean is an archaeologist. He's very comfortable with finding things in the forest. So he went, this is just 2 weeks ago, and he went right to where he thought it was. And he found what we think is the grand fir that had fallen many years ago and is covered in moss and has hemlocks growing out of it now. So it was great to just have someone complete that. And there is probably a runner-up grand fir growing in Pacific Spirit Park, I think, if it's still standing. So there's always a new tree. It's like an heir and a spare system. So I'm working on a book about these trees and I will finish that, but I'm never going to finish this project, and that's okay. I don't need to have a completionist mindset when it comes to these trees, but oddly I do when it comes to orthodontic appliances, as we mentioned. But having these failures along the way helps me get closer to my ultimate goal. You need to write something terrible in order to write something great, draft after draft. You need to learn again and again about trees and in the process about yourself, your limits, your learning, your pattern recognition. So I was looking for trees creative. Am I not just looking for things that others have already found? Well, there are no new ideas under the sun after all. Chapter 3, Create on the Edge. By being an amateur in this field, I'm operating in an edge space. In a terrific talk at the I/O Festival in 2016 called Design for Know-Nothings, Dilettantes, and Melancholy Interlopers, which I think is the best design talk title ever, artist Sarah Hendren identifies several key thinkers who have not been trained in the field in which they become famous. Jacques Cousteau, for instance, was not a trained scientist. He was a filmmaker. And I'm not suggesting that I'm going to become famous as a tree tracker, not by any measure. But Hendren argues that working on the edge can be productive and creative. We can see things in different ways than we could if we were trained in that field. The beauty of the BC Big Tree Registry is that it's open to amateurs who are passionate individuals. So a challenge for you. How can you think of yourself in an edge space and breathe new creativity into it? For instance, you might be a painter who works in the medical field, or a novelist with a day job in aeronautics. Or you might love hooping in your off hours, but you work in urban studies or urban planning. Liminal environments like the shoreline or the edge of a forest are exciting because they are rich in biodiversity and they're always changing. How does creativity overlap with something in your life that doesn't, on the surface, feel creative, like doing laundry or living through a pandemic? Where can you force the overlap for more creative results? So it kind of begs the question, does being an editor give me an edge as a big tree tracker? It doesn't really matter. Consider that when I got the idea for this project, I immediately tried to put structure on it. A spreadsheet, a map, color coding. I had so much color all over this Excel spreadsheet and I felt like I was in control of the project. I know books, so I put together a book proposal, an outline, a draft. That structure, though, eventually grew tiresome. Every writer gets sick of their book. Every painter is like, oh, this thing is crap. And then you move past that. In the end, what breathed new life into this project was chapter 4, Seek Communion. Being in the forest helped heal my burnout. It gave me something to focus on and a sense of accomplishment without any pressure. Initially, I did put a lot of pressure on myself, and gradually that just burned off. The project gave me a way to connect, not just with others, but with the natural world. And there are numerous studies of how being in the presence of nature is good for us, from living with houseplants to forest bathing. Studies have shown that being able to see a garden or a tree outside a hospital window can aid in healing. Being in the presence of big trees, like Big Lonely Doug, shown here and on the next slide, please, I'm holding Big Lonely Doug. Being in the presence of big trees sometimes brings me a feeling of transcendence, sure, but mostly it leads me to a more grounded plane. Myself, the tree, the broader environment. It literally roots me where I'm standing. And yes, I did finally make it to the island for a big tree trip this summer. Once the COVID numbers went down, I went out in August and I saw Big Lonely Doug, who's here as the second largest Douglas fir in Canada. It's the runner up champion in the province. It's 66 meters tall. And I saw a few more spectacular groves around Port Renfrew and Canada's gnarliest tree at Avatar Grove. Oftentimes, those who have connected with the natural world, your cat, a spider in your bathroom, a canyon, a beautiful tree, feel a duty to protect it. Merriam-Webster's defines biophilia as, quote, a hypothetical human tendency to interact or be closely associated with other forms of life in nature, a desire or tendency to commune with nature, unquote. So basically, it feels good to be in nature. We feel drawn to it. The term was coined by psychoanalyst Erich Fromm and popularized by Edward O. Wilson in his 1984 book, Biophilia. The hypothesis suggests that humans evolved in nature so that we have a need to be in connection with it. We find it comforting. We find it even healing. That we are now more disconnected from the natural world through being inside more often, connecting through human-made technologies, suggests that we may also be more disconnected from ourselves. So once I started connecting with these big trees, something interesting happened. I found myself noticing the natural world more often. It didn't just have to be big things. I have a really strong relationship with the silver maple outside my apartment window. When I looked closer, I realized that raccoons sometimes live in it. I started taking better care of the houseplants that I really try hard to keep alive with varying levels of success. I live in a very dark apartment. And, the really big elderberry in my friend's Chilliwack backyard, could it be a champion? Is it that big? I walk past a grove of willows now and I think they might be giants, to coin a phrase. But does it matter if they're champions? In the end, it's being to being. When we deny the natural world, we deny ourselves. We are part of the ecosystem, not apart from it. And that's a relationship worth protecting. If we don't take care of the world, it won't take care of us. We don't need to widen our lens to see the biggest in order to have a bigger experience or idea. So seek communion in the everyday with nature, however you can find it. So in conclusion, I'm going to give you a few tools that have helped me and that might help you. So the tools that you see on that picture are tools that I use for big tree trekking. So the gloves are ones that I picked up in a gas station for $7. They're the best investment I've ever made. I highly recommend them for walking around in the forest. And the GPS is one that UBC loaned me. So you don't need to go buy equipment. You can rent it or someone might loan you something that they have. And then that little waterproof notebook is one that I snagged as like swag at a mining conference that I crashed. So there's stuff out there. But I'm an editor, so I'm giving you an editor's toolkit for saving the world. Toni Morrison, a great American writer, said that creativity is not a finite resource. The more we use, the more we have. Sadly, that's not true of big trees. Once they're gone, it takes a really long time for them to grow back to the same extent, hundreds or thousands of years. If we're no longer able to gaze upon these big trees, what do we lose in our own creative imagining? Big trees allow us to realize what is possible. The tallest trees today, if given ideal conditions, will grow into the biggest trees. So how can you plant and water a seed and watch it root in your own life? So I'm going to share with you two of the tools in an editor's toolkit, which can be applied to conservation as well as creative practice. I know there's at least one editor in the audience today, and I hope that they're cheering for these tools. So STET. STET comes from the Latin, and it means let it stand. Writers and editors use it when they want to reject changes. It means go back to the original. TK means to come, and I see an editor cheering in the comments. TK means to come, and we use it as a stand-in for a better word or a fact we need to look up. It's TK, not TC, as that TK letter combination doesn't come up very often, unless of course you're writing about Sitka spruce or traditional knowledge. So I am, and I've had to use triple X in my manuscript, so it becomes like a very sexy draft. Not really at all. But consider this. In BC, 97% of old growth trees have already been logged. Put another way, according to a November article in the Narwhal, quote, only 2.7% of BC's original high productivity old growth forest remains, and more than 3/4 of that small fraction is slated to be logged, unquote. Being determined to champion does not necessarily protect a tree, though more protections are being brought in. In July 2019, for instance, the BC government moved to protect 54 of the biggest trees in the BC Big Tree Registry, as well as a 1 hectare buffer around each tree. And that's great, but it's 54 out of approximately 350 in the registry, and those 54 need to be on so-called crown land and not in parks or other protected areas. The problem is that we might cut down future champions while we're working on legislation. How many big trees are still out there waiting to be found and measured? The BC NDP government recently brought in a 2-year deferral to halt logging of 353,000 hectares while they consult with First Nations in the area. And that's good, but a deferral is not necessarily conservation, and only about 1% of that area is previously unprotected old growth forest, as was reported in The Guardian this week. While this deferral of specific areas is in effect, old growth is still being cut down. In November, TJ Watt, a Port Renfrew-based photographer and activist with the Ancient Forest Alliance, released these before and after shots. He'd last been to the area, the Kekus watershed, and did it at Territory in southwestern Vancouver Island in April of this year. When he returned, these old growth cedars had been logged. He was quoted in The Guardian as saying, "To come back and see a place that was so magnificent and complex, just completely and utterly destroyed is just gut-wrenching. And I encourage you to check out more of TJ's photos on the Ancient Forest Alliance website and on his Twitter. And he has a great website by his work, Great Christmas Presents." So we don't have an adequate conservation plan yet. A comprehensive plan that protects these trees is to come, TK. A better world is to come, TK. We can live within our limits and log second growth areas if we need to. In the meantime, I say STET. Stop cutting down these old growth forests. Stop cutting down these trees that we know offer so much more than economic value. Let it stand. Big old growth trees encourage biodiversity. They are carbon stores. They support Indigenous cultural practices. And they're also just really beautiful. So we need to nurture these trees and save them. We need to nurture ourselves and our creativity. Creativity is not a straight path. There's no one way to do it. There's no one answer. Sometimes you'll fail, or the GPS will steer you in the wrong direction, but it's worth it to go on. Another tree, another idea is always waiting. Thank you very much.
Hello, that was brilliant. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Brooke.
That last slide was painful. We shit where we eat, you know. It's this. So anyway, I wanted to ask you, you had a photograph with a Husqvarna thing on a tree in the picture when you had chapter 1.
Yeah.
What was that? What was that
Oh
thing?
yeah, so that is it is tree measuring tape. So it's just like a big measuring tape, and it has a hook on the end. So you hook it into the bark, and then you can run the tape around the tree. And it's kind of, mine is a little miniature version. A lot of people who work in this area use much bigger ones. But this just gives me like an approximate measurement of the tree. So it's really useful for measuring the circumference, and then you can use those grade 10 math skills and get the diameter. And then also measuring the crown of the tree, where basically you look up and you see, well, this is the width of the tree over here and then over here. And then you can work with a friend to measure out the crown in 2 directions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then you had a quote, "Burnout is actually a sense of hopelessness." And then I was listening, so I couldn't catch it. Who said it and what was the full quote?
Yeah, so it's I think it's burnout is a sense of hopelessness, and you move through it through a sense of accomplishment. So it's feeling that you can't get anything done, and that it's Anne Helen Peterson is the writer. So she said that in an interview. I think it was in Wealth Simple magazine. I don't know if it was quoted elsewhere, but her new book is called Can't Even, and it's about millennial burnout. So she writes about how, and I'm an elder millennial, so kind of like barely on the edge of claiming this, generational title. But it's how we're so overwhelmed with everything that's going on in society, and graduating with student debt and trying to find job security, that you just shut down. And so even having to, go to the bank or the dry cleaner or whatever becomes too much.
Too much.
Yeah.
And then my third question was, what are one or two or three of your favorite books when you were a child?
Oh, that's such a good question. My favorite book of all time, then and now, is Danny the Champion of the World by Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl is one of my favorite books or favorite authors. Um, I love the Ladybird books. I grew up in Ireland, and like the Ladybird books are really common in Ireland and England. And The Wind in the Willows. I really love that book.
So you've really stayed with nature.
Yeah.
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 Wow. Thank you for this. It was really, really, really wonderful.
Thanks so
you.
much for tuning in.
All right, Amanda, I think we got a few other questions here. We've got one from Chris here. Do we know who logged that last tree? Which company had or has the rights to that area?
Yeah, so that was Teal Jones, and I don't know much about that area and the logging rights, so I can't really say more than that. I only saw it when TJ posted those photos. So just to say that logging is still happening, and forestry is an essential part of the BC economy. So I'm not anti-forestry by any means, but it's really looking at where we're logging and do we need to cut these things down? I mean, the unfortunate reality is that those old growth cedars are worth a lot of money, and they can frame a number of houses, and there's a building boom on now, and price of lumber has gone up, and it puts a lot of strain on limited resources.
Absolutely. I've got another question here from Hillary. How did you discover your interest in writing and editing?
I've always just I'm pretty shy, and I always feel more comfortable communicating through words, like written words. So I don't know, I was always into writing as a kid. My parents really encouraged me, and my teachers encouraged me. I love reading, and so that fueled my interest in writing. And then my dad is a writer, so we had this really interesting father-daughter dynamic where he would write something and I would edit it. So I've always edited, professionally I've been editing for 12 or 13 years, but really I've been editing like my whole life. It just is kind of the air I breathe.
Totally. I think we've got a question from Mark.
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, just to point everyone to something earlier in the chat, someone named Tina had asked if there were good website resources for this sort of thing, like the registries. Someone else had asked, is there a US registry for like champion trees in the US? Other members of the community answered the questions and posted
that's great.
Other websites. There is a US registry. It's an easy Google find. So the answer is absolutely, they're all there. My question for you is happens after yesterday, completely coincidentally, reading a long, beautiful article about this fellow in BC who was a journalist who became obsessed with cryptozoology and hunting down Sasquatch in his case. And it just reminds me that I know I've had some run-ins with bears and creatures in the woods. In all of the times you've been wandering through, I'm sure you've had to go off paths. Have you encountered interesting moments in wilderness and nature? Maybe a
Totally. No, I haven't seen Sasquatch, but I've found some interesting things. So as a last minute edit or move this from the talk, but when I was looking for that grand fir in Chilliwack, I didn't find it, but I found a bunch of bear vomit, which is interesting, and just showed that bears were in the area and they were feasting on salmon that live in that river, the Chilliwack River. I've seen a lot of bears. I haven't had an encounter with a bear, like a dangerous encounter, thankfully. What I've learned is I was really scared of bears when I started this project, and I launched the project in June of 2018, and then I planned a road trip around BC to just like get myself comfortable with my province again. And I thought, well, I might as well see some trees now. I started this project, and so I just jumped into it. And 3 weeks later, I was up near, I was in the Nass Valley, and I went to this wonderful hot spring, which of course I'm forgetting the name of, and I soaked in this hot spring for a while. And then when I came out of the hot spring, this bear had been like eating skunk cabbage, or like rooting around in the skunk cabbage just nearby me. But of course the bear was more scared of me, so it ran off. And So that's thankfully been most of my experience. I'm more scared of cougars. Cougars, growing up in BC, we have a healthy fear of cougars because they're quiet, and if anyone goes hiking in these forests, to look up because they hang out on these big branches. Actually, the most dangerous encounter I had was when I was in Japan on that hike. There was a wild boar. Thankfully, it was running away from me, but those things you don't want to run into. And someone asked about ticks. No, I'm really fastidious when it comes to ticks. I tuck my pants into my socks and always give myself a brush down. So nothing yet.
All right, we've got a couple more questions here. We got one from Lucy here. Other than size, do you look for trees that have evidence of cultural significance?
Yeah, so that's something that archaeologists do really well. My sister actually happens to be an archaeologist. Her name is Jenny Botica, and she works at a company called Cleanza in BC. So she's taught me a lot about culturally modified trees, or CMTs. And the most visible sign of that would be a cedar that has a strip of bark pulled off, a strip of wood. And Indigenous peoples have lived here since time immemorial, and I'm totally a guest on these lands. And so these trees have been used in many ways for years, long before people started cutting them down to the extent that they are now. And they're still used in that way. So when I was up in Nisga'a territory in the Nass Valley, I saw fresh signs of CMTs, culturally modified trees in the forest. I don't go out looking for that type of cultural modification, but I love when I do find it, and I send photos to my sister so she can verify.
Right. Okay, we've got a question from Joel. I think, Mark, do you want to spotlight Joel for us?
Sure. Joel, can you turn your video on? There he is.
Hello. Yeah, just really curious, Amanda, whether you've had the honor and opportunity to ascend any of these trees.
I would totally love to. So I had plans to go to the top of the canopy. There's a group in BC, Matthew Beatty's involved. He's an arborist, and I'm blanking on the name, but if you Google like Big Tree Adventure Canopy Tour, you can find it. And I'd hoped to do that this spring, but then COVID happened. So they take you out in groups, and those just, I think, stopped happening. Either way, I was distracted from doing that because of the pandemic. So I haven't yet, but I would love to. I'm pretty scared of heights. Like I mentioned, I boulder, which is basically rock climbing. You don't go very high, and that's kind of for a reason. So maybe I will do that. I think I probably will, but no, not yet.
Absolutely worth it, and Matt Beatty is an incredible person to take you into the canopy. So
yes. He's really wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. This question comes from Caroline. Hearing that 97% of the forests are gone, it's hard to maintain hope in the future. How do you stay positive in light of the way things are trending?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I'm a pretty buoyant person generally. Like I go through periods of depression and everything else, like everyone else. We all get low at times. I think because I've seen things change in my lifetime, and because of the reading that I do and the research that I do, I take a long view of things. So we can look at other movements that aren't the environmental movements, like the civil rights movement. People talk about that happening. It happened in the 60s, and there were great strides, and now look where we are. But that movement is still ongoing, right? So I think it's more just having people who are committed to it every day and making small changes in your life and speaking up about these trees that are being cut down, or about climate change, or about being anti-racist actively in your life. That's what gives me hope. What really gives me hope is when people who have firmly held one position are able to be vulnerable and open themselves up to hearing another position.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that.